On August 18, 1966, 108 Australian soldiers walked into a rubber plantation in southern Vietnam and encountered 2,500 enemy troops. The mathematics were catastrophic. The outcome should have been a massacre. Every military doctrine ever written says you don't fight when you're outnumbered 23-1. You retreat. You call for support. You survived. The Australians didn't retreat. They stood and fought. And when it was over, the enemy that outnumbered them had left 504, confirmed dead in the mud of the long tan rubber plantation. How did 108 men defeat 2,500? What made the enemy commanders issue an internal warning that would echo through military intelligence files for years? Do not fight them? And why did American generals, watching from the sidelines, fall silent in the after-action briefings? Stay until the end, because the answer dismantles everything conventional military wisdom believes about numbers, firepower, and what makes a soldier truly dangerous. August 18, 1966, Phuoc Thu Province, South Vietnam. The afternoon sky is the color of old iron, heavy with monsoon clouds that press down on the rubber plantation like a fist. The trees stand in perfect colonial rows, their white-barked trunks dripping with rain that began 2 hours ago and has not stopped. The mud is red, the color of rust, the color of things that don't wash clean. In the wet silence between thunderclaps, something moves in the trees ahead. Private Peter Dinsdale, forward scout for 11 Platoon D Company, 6th Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, sees it first. Not a figure, not a defined shape, but an absence. A wrongness in the pattern of light and shadow between the rubber trees. His hand comes up, fist closed. The patrol stops. Every man sinks to one knee. The rain hammers down on broad rubber leaves, generating a white noise that swallows small sounds. What Dinsdale has seen, without yet understanding the scale of what he's seeing, is the forward edge of a Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army force 23 times larger than his entire company. They are everywhere in those trees. They have been waiting. They know exactly how many Australians are coming, and they believe, with the confidence of commanders who have never been wrong about such arithmetic, that this will be a simple slaughter. They have never been more wrong about anything in their lives. To understand what happened at Long Tan and why it became one of the most studied small unit engagements in military history requires understanding the context in which it occurred. Not just the tactical situation, but the broader strategic reality that made Long Tan both inevitable and extraordinary. Australia had committed combat forces to Vietnam in 1965 as part of its alliance obligations and genuine belief in the domino theory, the fear that communist expansion through Southeast Asia threatened the stability of the region, including Australia itself. The Australian commitment was initially modest. Advisors and a battalion, then an expansion to a task force headquartered at Nui Dat in Phuoc Thu Province. By 1966, the first Australian task force comprised approximately 4,500 personnel, a significant contribution for a nation of 12 million people. Phuoc Thu Province was assigned to the Australians as their operational area of responsibility. It was a deliberate choice by both governments. The province gave Australian commanders a defined area they could manage according to their own doctrine, rather than being subordinated to American command in a piecemeal fashion. This independence was significant. The Australians had different tactical philosophies than their American allies, and operating in their own area allowed them to implement those philosophies without constant friction. The philosophy they brought was shaped by decades of experience. Australian soldiers had fought in 2 world wars, in Korea, in Malaya during the emergency, and in Borneo during the confrontation with Indonesia. Each conflict had taught lessons that were absorbed into doctrine and training. The Malayan Emergency, in particular, had produced a generation of soldiers skilled in jungle warfare, in small unit operations, in the patient, methodical clearing of enemy forces from difficult terrain. They had learned that jungle warfare rewarded discipline, marksmanship, and controlled aggression over speed and mass. American doctrine in Vietnam operated on different assumptions. The American approach was characterized by air mobility, massive firepower, and search and destroy operations intended to attrite enemy forces through overwhelming violence. Helicopters delivered troops into contact zones. Artillery and air support provided devastating firepower, and body counts measured success. This approach had logic to it, particularly given America's extraordinary industrial and technological advantages. But it also had weaknesses that would become increasingly apparent as the war extended. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army had studied American tactics carefully. They had developed countermeasures that neutralized American technological advantages, operating in small units, moving at night, attacking and withdrawing before air support could be called in, maintaining base areas in dense jungle that proved difficult to clear completely. Against American units, they had learned when to fight and when to disappear. Against the Australians, they had learned something different. The Australians were harder to find, harder to ambush, and devastatingly effective in the firefights they chose to accept. The SAS had been hunting them for months, killing with efficiency that produced kill ratios the enemy found incomprehensible. Australian conventional infantry, while less specialized than the SAS, carried similar qualities of marksmanship, fire discipline, and tactical patience that made them formidable opponents. By mid-1966, the Viet Cong commanders in Phuoc Thu province had decided they needed to destroy the Australian base at Nui Dat, not to win the war in a single stroke, but to demonstrate that the Australians were as vulnerable as any other foreign force, to show the local population that no one could protect them, and to disrupt Australian operations that were systematically degrading Viet Cong capability in the province. The plan was ambitious. The 275th Viet Cong Regiment, reinforced with elements of D-445 Provincial Mobile Battalion, would move to the area southeast of Nui Dat, fire mortar and rockets into the base, and draw out an Australian response. The Australians would inevitably send a patrol or company to investigate. That patrol would walk into a killing ground prepared by forces numbering in the thousands. It would be destroyed quickly, with a shock effect that would reverberate through Australian and American command. A company was wiped out in minutes. That was the plan. On the night of August 17th, the attack began. Mortar and rockets fell on Nui Dat, wounding 24 Australian soldiers and creating exactly the response the Viet Cong expected. The base commander ordered D Company 6 RAR to conduct a patrol into the Long Tan area, the direction from which the attack seemed to have originated. D Company was not at full strength. One of its platoons had suffered casualties in the rocket attack and was unavailable. The company went out with 3 rifle platoons and a headquarters element, 108 men in total. Their orders were to find signs of the enemy, who had attacked the base, conduct reconnaissance, and report back. They were not expected to find 2,500 enemy soldiers. The patrol moved south from Nui Dat in the early afternoon, entering the Long Tan rubber plantation. The plantation was eerie terrain. Rubber trees planted in colonial-era rows that created long sight lines in one direction and absolute concealment in others. Rain had started, the beginning of a monsoon downpour that would characterize the entire battle. Visibility dropped as rain hammered through the canopy. Sound became unreliable, the drumming of rain on rubber leaves masking movement. At approximately 1540 hours, 11 Platoon, the forward element of D Company, made contact with a small Viet Cong group. A brief firefight erupted and the enemy withdrew. Standard patrol procedure dictated that the company advance to see where the enemy had gone. The platoon pushed forward, moving through the rain and the rows of rubber trees. What they walked into was the forward screen of the 275th Regiment. The small contact had been a trigger, the moment the enemy commanders had been waiting for. As 11 platoon advanced, fire exploded from 3 sides simultaneously. Automatic weapons, rocket-propelled grenades, mortar rounds. The platoon was hit, hard and immediately. Private Dinsdale and the men of 11 Platoon found themselves the focus of a massive enemy force that had been waiting, prepared, positioned to destroy them. They went to ground, returning fire with the controlled efficiency that Australian infantry training demanded. But the weight of fire coming at them was extraordinary. Men began going down. The company commander, Major Harry Smith, heard the contact and understood immediately that this was not a routine encounter. The volume of fire indicated a substantial enemy force. He ordered the other platoons to move up in support, attempting to establish a defensive position around the beleaguered. Forward platoon. What followed over the next 3 hours was one of the most extraordinary defensive actions in Australian military history. D Company established a company perimeter in the middle of the rubber plantation, 3 platoons holding a rough oval of ground perhaps 200 meters in diameter. Outside that perimeter, thousands of enemy soldiers attacked in waves. They came through the rain, through the rows of rubber trees, screaming and firing, throwing everything they had at the small Australian position. The Australians held, and the reasons they held expose every truth about what makes infantry effective. First reason was marksmanship. Australian infantry doctrine placed extraordinary emphasis on individual shooting ability. Australian soldiers were trained to deliver aimed, accurate fire, not to spray rounds toward the enemy and hope for effect. In the chaos of the Long Tan battle, with rain obscuring vision and enemy soldiers appearing from multiple directions, this individual marksmanship produced kill rates that the enemy hadn't anticipated. The L1A1 self-loading rifle, the standard Australian infantry weapon, was powerful and accurate. In skilled hands, it was devastating. Australian soldiers were those skilled hands. The second reason was fire discipline. Controlled fire, maintaining ammunition, ensuring that every shot was purposeful rather than reactive. The Australians were outnumbered by a ratio that meant they couldn't afford to waste ammunition. They fired carefully, reloaded deliberately, maintained their rate of fire at levels that remained effective without becoming undisciplined. This was training overriding the natural human instinct to fire more when afraid. It required a level of self-control under extreme fire that most military forces never develop. The third reason was the artillery. Battery Sergeant Major Jack Kirby and the artillery support from 161 Battery, Royal New Zealand Artillery, provided fire support that was extraordinarily accurate and responsive. The guns were firing danger close, shells landing within meters of Australian positions, with a precision and tempo that required both technical excellence from the gun crews and extraordinary courage from the infantry calling the fire. At one point, artillery rounds were landing so close to Australian positions that soldiers could feel the overpressure of detonation. But the shells landing in the enemy's attacking formations were catastrophic. The fourth reason was psychology. The Australians were afraid. Of course they were. Any honest account of Long Tan includes the fear, the knowledge that the position might be overrun, the awareness that help was far away, and the enemy was very close and very numerous. But Australian military culture had developed mechanisms for managing fear, for converting terror into controlled aggression rather than panic. The training was so thorough, so deeply ingrained, that it operated even when conscious thought was overwhelmed by the instinct to flee. American military. Observers were stunned by the after-action accounts, not because they doubted the courage of Australian soldiers, but because the tactical execution under those conditions exceeded what they had witnessed from their own troops in similar situations. One American officer attached to the task force headquarters wrote in his report, "D Company's performance at Long Tan represents small unit tactics and fire discipline at a level rarely documented in modern warfare. Their ability to maintain controlled, accurate fire while receiving fire from a force 23 times their size defies conventional analysis." The battle lasted 3 hours and 40 minutes. It was nearly over before help arrived. Reinforcements. 10 APCs carrying a company, 6 RAR, fought through enemy forces to reach D Company's position, just as darkness fell and the enemy assault was reaching its final intensity. The enemy commanders made a decision at that moment that determined the outcome. They withdrew. Their force had suffered catastrophic casualties and had failed to destroy the Australians. Continuing the attack offered no prospect of reversing those results. They pulled back into the jungle, leaving their dead behind. The morning of August 19th revealed the scale of what had happened. Australian soldiers walked the battleground in the gray dawn light, moving through the rubber plantation, in the wet silence that followed the catastrophe. What they found was documented with careful military precision in after-action reports that became required reading in military academies. Worldwide, 245 Viet Cong bodies were recovered on the battlefield. Blood trails discarded. Weapons and other evidence indicated additional casualties removed by the withdrawing enemy. Intelligence analysis suggested total enemy casualties, killed and wounded, exceeded 500. The most conservative official estimate placed confirmed enemy killed at 245, with later analysis suggesting the true figure was higher. Total Australian casualties: 17 killed, 24 wounded, 108 Australians had inflicted those losses while holding a perimeter, against 23 times their number for nearly 4 hours in monsoon rain. The after-action reports submitted to military assistance Command Vietnam headquarters caused a reaction that ranged from skepticism to disbelief. Initial American assessment questioned the accuracy of the figures. Battle damage assessment from aerial reconnaissance didn't match the ground reports. Some American staff officers suggested the numbers were inflated, that the Australians were overcounting enemy dead to make their performance look better than it was. This response revealed something important about the cultural relationship between the two allied forces. America's military was, in 1966, beginning to experience the difficulties that would eventually define the Vietnam War as a catastrophe. Kill counts that were manipulated for political purposes, body count pressure from commanders, statistics that didn't match reality. The assumption that D Company's numbers were inflated came partly from the general environment of statistical dishonesty that American military culture was developing. The Australians were furious. Their tradition was conservative reporting, deliberately understating enemy casualties rather than overcounting them. The men of D Company had walked that plantation themselves in daylight and counted bodies. The number they reported was lower than the number of dead they had seen because they counted only what they could be certain of. The suggestion that they had fabricated or exaggerated figures was received as an insult there. Professional integrity. General William Westmoreland, commanding American forces in Vietnam, visited the site. He saw the battlefield evidence himself, the bodies, the weapons, the blood-soaked ground between the rubber trees. He was a career military man who understood what the evidence meant. His personal assessment, shared privately with aides, acknowledged that what D Company had accomplished was exceptional by any military standard. His public assessment was more measured, framed within the broader American statistical approach to the war. The Viet Kong leadership's response to Long Tan was documented in captured documents and intelligence reports. It was more honest than some American assessments. Internal communications from 275th Regiment commanders to higher headquarters described the battle with brutal accuracy. A planned destruction of an Australian company had become a catastrophic defeat. The regiment had suffered losses that would require months to rebuild. The Australians had demonstrated a level of defensive fighting ability that hadn't been anticipated, the most significant document captured in a subsequent operation, and translated by Australian intelligence, was an internal directive circulated to Viet Cong and NVA units operating in Phuoc Thu Province. It advised unit commanders to avoid direct engagement with Australian infantry whenever possible. The Australians' marksmanship and fire discipline made frontal assault prohibitively costly. The directive used language that acknowledged a form of military respect. These were not soldiers who would break under pressure. They would die in position before they withdrew. Fighting them directly meant accepting casualties. The command could not sustain, but do not fight them. Those three words represented something unprecedented in the experience of both Viet Cong commanders and the American military observers who eventually read the intelligence reports. The enemy was issuing internal warnings about the Australians that they had never issued about American conventional units. They would fight Americans. They had developed tactics to engage, attrite, and disengage from American forces. But the Australians were different. The Australians were something they didn't want to fight at all. This distinction resonated through American military channels in ways that were both illuminating and uncomfortable. American forces in Vietnam had, by 1966, achieved something that the doctrine said should be decisive: overwhelming technological and firepower superiority. Helicopters could insert troops anywhere in minutes. B-52 strikes could level entire grid squares. Artillery support could be called into any target. By the logic of industrial-era warfare, this firepower dominance should have been sufficient to destroy any enemy force. The enemy hadn't cooperated with this logic. They had found ways to fight that neutralized American advantages, using terrain, timing, and the fundamental will to endure losses that American public opinion wouldn't accept. The war wasn't going the way the doctrine said it should, and American commanders were beginning, reluctantly, to understand why. The Australians offered a contrast that was both instructive and uncomfortable. They were achieving results without the technological advantages Americans relied on. They were producing kill ratios that exceeded American performance with smaller forces, less equipment, and fewer casualties. They were, in critical respects, fighting the war more effectively. The L1A1 rifle became the symbol that carried this truth through the campaign. It was heavier than the American M16, slower to reload, with a smaller magazine. By several conventional measures, it was an inferior weapon. American doctrine emphasized volume of fire, and the M16 could produce substantially higher rates of fire than the L1A1. During the weapons comparisons that occurred at joint training events, American soldiers consistently noted the M16's theoretical superiority in terms of rounds per minute. But the Australians weren't fighting by theoretical measures. They were fighting by aimed shots, by individual marksmanship, by the principle that one accurate round was worth 20 unaimed ones. The L1A1's power and accuracy made it devastating in the hands of trained marksmen, which every Australian soldier was required to be. At Long Tan, with ammunition limited by the distance from supply lines and the weight soldiers could carry into a patrol expected to last hours, not days, the L1A1's accuracy meant that every round counted. Australian soldiers fired fewer rounds than Americans in equivalent engagements. They scored more kills. The after-action analysis that examined ammunition expenditure at Long Tan against enemy casualties produced a figure that American analysts found difficult to reconcile with their doctrine. The Australians had fired approximately 25,000 rounds of small arms ammunition and achieved 245 confirmed kills, with the actual figure likely higher. The kill-per-round ratio was extraordinary by any standard. American units in equivalent engagements typically expended 5 to 10 times as many rounds per confirmed kill. This wasn't accidental. It was the result of training philosophy, of the decision to invest in marksmanship rather than volume of fire, of cultural belief that a soldier's most important quality was the ability to shoot accurately under pressure. Australian recruit. Training spent more time on rifle marksmanship than almost any other comparable military. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't dramatic. It was hours on the range developing the muscle memory and mental discipline to place rounds accurately when everything around you was designed to prevent that accuracy. The training paid off on NN. August evening in a rubber plantation in Phuoc Thu province. When 2,500 enemy soldiers attacked from the dark and the rain, the men of D Company fell back on exactly that training. They aimed. They fired. They reloaded. And aimed again. While the enemy's fire was often suppressive, volume designed to keep heads down and create chaos, the Australians' fire was aimed at identified targets. The asymmetry and effectiveness was dramatic. American observers began requesting attachment to Australian units for training purposes. The requests went through official channels and were handled diplomatically, but the underlying message was clear. The Americans recognized that the Australians were doing something better. Joint training exercises were arranged, initially framed as mutual exchange, but in practice oriented toward American officers learning from Australian doctrine. The friction points in these exchanges were instructive. American officers consistently struggled with Australian fire discipline, the requirement to hold fire until the target was clearly acquired, to resist the impulse to fire when unsure of target location, to accept risk in the name of accuracy. American soldiers were trained to fire when they felt threatened, to suppress potential enemy positions, even if they couldn't identify specific targets. This approach made sense with the ammunition supply Americans could sustain. It was incompatible with the results Australians achieved. 1. American company commander who attended an exchange program wrote in his evaluation report, "Australian fire discipline is extraordinary, and their results prove its value." However, implementing this standard in American units would require fundamental change to training programs and cultural attitudes about combat. American soldiers are trained to be aggressive with fire. Australian soldiers are trained to be accurate with fire. The distinction produces different outcomes in sustained engagement. The distinction between aggression with fire and accuracy with fire captured the philosophical divide more precisely than any other formulation. It was not that Australians lacked aggression long-tan, proved that they possessed it in quantities. That dwarfed almost any reasonable standard. It was that their aggression was channeled differently. They were aggressive in holding ground, in refusing to withdraw, in accepting close combat at disadvantageous odds. They were precise with their weapons, patient with their ammunition, deliberate in their killing. The American approach channeled aggression differently, into firepower, into volume, into the industrial logic of overwhelming the enemy with more of everything. This approach had worked in World War II, where industrial production and logistics could sustain the ammunition expenditure it required. In Vietnam, where the enemy was dispersed, mobile, and fought mostly in small engagements, the industrial approach created enormous logistical burden without producing corresponding results. Tan exposed this inefficiency in starker terms than any analysis could have produced. Here was documentation, written in blood and confirmed by body counts, that a small, accurately fighting force could hold ground against overwhelming numbers and inflict casualties that a larger, more expensively equipped force might not have achieved. The implications were uncomfortable for an institution committed to its existing doctrine. The months following Long Tan continued to produce evidence of Australian effectiveness. D Company was not an anomaly. Other Australian units operating in Phuoc Chu Province produced similar kill ratios in smaller engagements. The SAS continued its operations with documented kill ratios that exceeded anything comparable forces achieved. The pattern was consistent. Australian forces, operating with less firepower and smaller numbers, were producing better results than their resource allocation would predict. Intelligence assessments began to include analysis of enemy behavioral changes in Phuoc Chu Province versus adjacent American operational areas. Enemy activity in the Australian area was demonstrably lower. Not because the enemy had been driven out, they were still present, still active. But their willingness to initiate contact with Australian units had declined significantly after Long Tan. The do not fight them directive had apparently been taken seriously by unit commanders who had seen its wisdom proven on August 18th. This behavioral change had strategic implications. The Viet Cong's ability to move supplies, reinforce units, and maintain political influence in villages required freedom of movement. When enemy commanders directed their forces to avoid contact with Australian patrols, they were accepting constraints on their operations that accumulated over time into genuine degradation of capability. Villages that Viet Cong political cadres previously visited regularly became harder to access. Supply routes that had been safe became dangerous. The invisible but constant pressure of Australian presence, both through the SAS patrols and through the knowledge that D Company's performance represented the capability of the entire task force, constrained enemy freedom of action. This was not the American body count model of success. The Australians weren't measuring their effectiveness in enemy kills, though their kill ratios were exceptional. They were measuring it in enemy capability degraded, in freedom of movement denied, in the gradual erosion of Viet Cong organizational strength in their province. This approach required patience that American doctrine didn't value and a timeline that American political pressure wouldn't sustain. The American officers who saw these results most clearly were often those with most direct experience of Australian operations. They recognized that what they were witnessing was a different theory of counterinsurgency, one with historical grounding in the British-Malayan emergency and the principles developed by Field Marshal Templer about winning population and denying enemy organization rather than simply killing enemy soldiers. The Australians had taken these principles seriously because they had fought in Malaya and seen them work. American military doctrine in Vietnam had different ancestry. It came from World War II, from Korea, from the concept of applying maximum industrial power to destroy enemy military capability. The Vietnam enemy was not organized to be destroyed by this approach. The Viet Cong's strength was not military in the conventional sense. It was political, organizational, distributed, through villages and jungle alike. Destroying it required a different kind of warfare than the doctrine supported. The Battle of Long Tan thus became symbolic beyond its tactical significance. It was evidence, specific and documented, that the Australian approach produced results inconsistent with the American assumption that technology and firepower solved military problems. 17 Australian soldiers had died holding that rubber plantation. Their deaths were real and grievous. But by the mathematics of military effectiveness that the Vietnam War was using to measure everything, the exchange was staggering. 17 Australians for a minimum of 245 enemy dead, with total enemy casualties likely exceeding 500. Symbolism of the L1A1 persisted through this analysis. The rifle was standard issue, not a specialist weapon, not high technology, not expensive relative to the helicopters and artillery systems that defined American firepower. It was a simple machine, a metal and wood instrument for propelling bullets with accuracy. Its effectiveness at Long Tan was not inherent in the mechanism. The M16 was technically capable of equal or greater accuracy at the ranges where the battle occurred. The effectiveness resided entirely in the men behind the rifles, in their training, their discipline, their ability to aim when everything demanded that they simply fire. The rifle aimed. This was the core truth. Not the rifle fired, but the rifle aimed. Australian soldiers held their sight pictures under incoming fire, tracked moving targets through monsoon rain, selected the most dangerous enemy weapons first, managed their ammunition with deliberate consciousness, and killed accurately while being shot at. These were not superhuman abilities. They were trained behaviors, the result of military culture that had decided precision mattered more than volume years after Long Tan. Military historians examining the battle in the context of the broader Vietnam War would note that it represented a form of military excellence rarely documented in modern warfare. Small unit defensive actions against overwhelming numbers were not uncommon in history, but few produced the combination of tactical coherence, fire discipline, and psychological resilience that D Company displayed. The conditions were designed to produce panic, rain that obscured visibility, fire from multiple directions, casualties accumulating, reinforcement far away, the knowledge of being outnumbered by factors that should have made resistance hopeless. Men didn't panic. They fought with a methodical quality that observers found almost eerie to read in the after-action accounts. Platoon commanders maintained control of their sections, directing fire, managing casualties, calling for artillery adjustments, doing all the complex intellectual and physical work of infantry. Command while bullets passed within centimeters of their bodies. Section commanders maintained their fire discipline, keeping their men aimed and shooting even as the men beside them were hit. Private soldiers doing exactly what they had been trained to do. Aim, fire, reload. Aim again. The Viet Cong commanders who watched their assault waves, broken against that small Australian perimeter, experienced something they hadn't anticipated. They had expected a company to crumble under the weight of their attack. Every rational military calculation said it should have crumbled. When it didn't, when the Australians simply kept fighting with the terrible steadiness of men who had decided they would not move, the psychological impact on the attacking force was significant. An enemy that cannot be moved by force develops a psychological hold over those attempting to move them. The do not fight them directive grew from this experience. It was not an acknowledgement of cowardice or unwillingness to fight. The Viet Cong were courageous soldiers who had fought for years against enemies with every material advantage. The directive was a rational military assessment. Fighting the Australians directly produced unacceptable casualties. Finding ways to achieve objectives without direct engagement was more cost-effective than mounting assaults that would break. Against Australian fire discipline, when American military intelligence circulated this information through headquarters channels, the response varied. Some officers recognized it as extraordinarily significant. The enemy was issuing warnings to their own troops about one component of the Allied force, while apparently not issuing similar warnings about other components. This implied the Australians were doing something differently and more effectively than American conventional units. Other officers dismissed it or noted it without changing their own approaches. The institutional resistance to absorbing lessons from smaller allies was substantial. American military culture in 1966 was still confident, still committed to its doctrine, not yet confronted with the evidence that doctrine was failing. Long Tan was one data point, impressive, but not sufficient to drive change in a large institution with enormous investment in its existing approach. The transformation that occurred was slower, more partial, and more contested than the dramatic simplicity of one battle's outcome would suggest it should have been. Some American units in Vietnam quietly adopted elements of Australian doctrine, particularly around fire discipline and marksmanship training. Some officers who observed Australian operations took lessons back to their units and implemented them without official authorization. The bottom-up learning that characterized much of American tactical adaptation in Vietnam included influence from Australian examples, but the larger doctrinal framework didn't change. American forces continued to fight primarily with the industrial firepower model. Body counts continued to drive assessment. Helicopters and artillery continued to define the operational style. The war continued to produce results that didn't match the model's predictions. Australia withdrew its combat forces from Vietnam in 1972, having lost 521 soldiers killed, a casualty figure that reflected both the genuine danger of their service and the comparative effectiveness of their approach in limiting losses. Their kill ratios across the deployment remained extraordinarily high. Their effectiveness in degrading enemy capability in Phuoc Thu Province was documented in intelligence assessments that noted genuine organizational damage to Viet Cong structures in the area. Long Tan entered military legend. The date, August 18, became Australia's Vietnam Veterans Day, a commemoration of sacrifice that also acknowledged extraordinary achievement. The 17 men who died in the rubber plantation were honored as they deserved, as soldiers who had held their ground against impossible odds and given their lives in the service of something larger than themselves, but beyond commemoration. Lay education. Long Tan became a case study in military academies on 5 continents. Officers in American, British, Canadian, and other allied forces studied the battle for lessons about fire discipline, small unit tactics, defensive fighting, and the relationship between training investment and battlefield performance. The battle's outcome generated questions that serious military thinkers felt obligated to answer. How had this been possible? What had produced the capability that made it possible? And what could be learned and replicated? The answers pointed consistently to the same factors: training philosophy, marksmanship emphasis, fire discipline culture, small unit leadership development, the expectation that every soldier understood why they were fighting, not just how. These were not expensive capabilities in the financial sense. They were expensive in the time and cultural commitment required to develop them. They required military organizations to value what was difficult to measure: individual skill, unit cohesion, professional identity, the intangible qualities that determined how soldiers behaved when everything was against them. The American military eventually absorbed many of these lessons, though the process took years and was accelerated by the failures of Vietnam that forced genuine institutional reconsideration. The transformation of the American Special Operations community in the 1970s and 1980s incorporated principles that the Australians had demonstrated in Vietnam. The development of force training standards that emphasized individual marksmanship, small unit cohesion, and the kind of tactical patience that Long Tan had shown to be decisive drew, in part, on the evidence that Australian performance had provided. The L1A1 rifle rusted in storage after the Australian Army transitioned to newer weapons, its wooden stock weathering, its mechanism growing stiff with disuse. But what it had represented, what it had been in trained hands on a monsoon evening in a rubber plantation, persisted in something that didn't rust: the doctrine it had helped prove, the institutional memory of what individual skill and fire discipline could achieve. The knowledge that technology had limits and human capability had none. In the silence after Long Tan, when the last of the enemy had withdrawn and the rain continued to fall on the dead between the rubber trees, rifles were cleaned and the ammunition was counted. The platoon commanders made their reports. The company commander relayed them to the battalion. The figures moved up the chain of command and eventually into the classified files, where they would be studied for decades. 17 dead, 245 confirmed enemy killed, with the true figure certainly higher, 108 men, 2,500 attackers. Do not fight them. In the end, that directive, issued by enemy commanders who had learned the hard way what the Australians could do, carried more weight than any commendation from Allied headquarters. The enemy knew. They had tested the Australians with their best available force, committed everything they had to destroying one company, and had been broken against the wall of aimed fire and absolute refusal to yield. They had retreated, leaving hundreds of dead in red mud, and they had told their commanders what they had experienced. These men were different. They fought with a precision and a steadiness that massed force could not overcome. Every calculation of numbers and advantage meant nothing when it encountered that fire discipline, that training, that cultural commitment to accuracy over volume and skill over technology. The rubber plantation at Long Tan stands today as a monument without a monument, a commercial agricultural site that knows nothing of what occurred between its trees. The rain still falls in August monsoon, still hammers the broad leaves, still turns the red earth to mud. The trees grow taller every year, moving further from the events of 1966, but in the memory of soldiers and historians, in the curriculum of military academies, in the doctrine of special operations forces, they can trace their principles back through this battle to something ancient and fundamental about what makes a soldier dangerous. Long Tan remains vivid. 100 men holding ground that couldn't be held. 1,000 men dying against fire that shouldn't have been sufficient to stop them. The directive that an enemy issued to its own troops, acknowledging what Allied headquarters was slow to admit: do not fight them. Because when they stand and fight, you will not win. Because their rifles are aimed, not merely pointed. Because their discipline does not break under fire that would break lesser men. Because something in how they were trained, how they were formed as soldiers, how they understood their own identity and purpose, made them capable of something that the mathematics of war said was impossible. Freedom is not defended by numbers alone. It is defended by the quality of those who choose to defend it, by their willingness to stand when everything says retreat, by the precision with which they apply force when the moment demands it, and by the cultural investment that prepared them to be, in that moment, something more than just armed men in a field. Long Tan proved that investment. The dead proved it. The living proved it. And the enemy, retreating through the rubber trees into the monsoon darkness, proved it most of all in the words they wrote in their dispatches and the warning they passed to their comrades. 108 Australians stood in that plantation and refused to be moved. 17 of them gave everything. The rest gave enough. And together they wrote something into military history that no amount of institutional resistance could erase. That excellence, trained and sustained and expressed under the worst possible conditions, is the truest force multiplier any military ever possessed. The rifle aimed, the line held, the rain fell, and in the morning the truth lay visible between the rubber trees.